Thank you for joining MOBE Mondays.
Cultural Solutions Group, but I'm also a proud advisory board member for MOBE. And MOBE, the acronym, stands for Marketing Opportunities in Business and Entertainment. For those of you who are not familiar with MOBE, the organization was co-founded by entertainment and marketing veterans Yvette Moyo and Curtis Simons in 1992. That's a long time of entertainment and marketing. And they've been committed to making sure that we have opportunities as a Black people in those areas. The organization was designed to develop business building, education, and mentoring services for Black professionals within marketing, sports, entertainment, financial services, and an array of industries. But what I'm most proud of is that the organization has facilitated an estimated $200 million in business to Black-owned companies. I'm going to say that for the people in the back, $200 million. Now that's impact as a direct result of the associations conceived at MOBE symposiums. So today, I have the privilege of interviewing a man deemed by his peers as one of the most important journalists in American history, the award-winning journalist and author of Conversations in Black on Power, Politics, and Leaderships, and a man I am privileged to call a friend, the distinguished Mr. Ed Gordon. What's up, Ed?
How you doing, Dorinda?
I'm great. How you doing?
Well, considering I'm doing all right. We're all in this thing together, as we keep saying, but so very happy to be a part of this. I know we were going to try to do this live, of course, but this is a great alternative.
It sure is. So before I get into the book, which I have to tell you was a page turner, I couldn't put it down. There was so many good insights and thought-provoking discussions and conversations that you documented in the book. But I want to know, how are you and Leslie and the kids, and how's everybody doing in the midst of this COVID crisis?
Well, I am the only one in the Midwest. I was in the midst of this book tour when all of this hit. I just left Atlanta, was coming up on New Jersey and DC and Philly and Chicago when everything started to slow down. We've split our time between the West Coast and here in my hometown of Detroit. And so at first we all thought, oh, this will be a week or two. And then when quarantine and shutdown came, I've been the one who is stuck here in Michigan while everybody else is in LA. So we chat via text and the like, and I'm trying to hold it down here because, as many people know, Michigan is such a hot spot right now. And many people saw the very sad story of the 5-year-old girl who lost her life to COVID over the weekend. And just for any of us who think that this thing can't touch us, we need to be very careful and vigilant, and just stay home until A, they tell us we can go, and then B, more importantly, when you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, my husband got sick in February, and we actually think he had COVID because he had a virus that caused congestive heart failure. And we now think it was actually COVID. So we're just blessed that he's still around and feeling much better. So let's get into it, because this book was so good. Tell us the impetus behind you writing this book, Conversations in Black.
Well, actually, you know, what I thought about is the many years I've been doing these conversations, interviews, and the like with all of these great people. I found that often the best parts of the interview started either before we sat down and did the official interview, or when we cut the camera off and we were just chewing the fat between us. And I said, wouldn't it be great if I could capture some of that? Because people are a bit more candid when the camera's not on them. And then I thought about all the great people I've talked to over my lifetime. And I said, well, if I could get some of these people in the same room at the same time, wouldn't that be marvelous? I actually started the first iteration of this book in 2012. That's when the idea came to me. Obama was just going into term number 2. Trayvon Martin had just been killed. I started interviews. I talked to Maya Angelou, and this will show you the difference in 8 years. Bill Cosby was one of the people that I interviewed for the book at that time. And then I got a television project, and I had to put that idea down. And then maybe about 18 months ago, I thought to myself, that was such a great idea. I wanted to pick it back up. So I started all over again. I picked 40 plus people that I would talk to and interview. Each chapter is a different topic. And what I did is I was the linchpin. So while no one was in the same room at the same time, it reads as if we were all sitting around having a conversation. So I did 43, 44 interviews and put it all together. And
Wow,
just finally,
it's fantastic.
one of the reasons I wanted to do it is I am of the belief, and I think this crisis allows us to really kickstart. I'm of the belief that our community has to have new narratives. I think the narratives that we've used, particularly since the civil rights movement, in many ways have helped us and have been great. And I think some of them are a bit outdated. I think some of the ways of our leadership have to be challenged a bit more than we have in the past. I think our demands have to be greater. And so what I wanted to do with this book is give us a starting point, a jumping off point, and to get a myriad of voices to talk to us about how we might do that.
What I'm hoping as the outcome of this book is that people give it to their children, because I think millennials, the Gen Z generation, I think this will be a good starting point for them to think about how they're going to emerge as leaders as well.
Yeah, and
So,
I made
go
sure
ahead.
that I got a number of voices in the book. It's not all tried and true leadership, though we have that. You know, we've got Maxine Waters and Al Sharpton and Derek Johnson from the NAACP and Mark Morial, but we also have Angela Rye and Jamel Hill and Charlemagne the God and Stacey Abrams and Michael Eric Dyson and Ben Crump and Trayvon Martin's mom, Sabrina Fulton. I mean, the list goes on and on. Killer Mike, Harry Belafonte is a part of the book. So we have a diverse group of people talking to us.
And I love that you gather different viewpoints, because, you know, we do need that differentiation of, you know, what people think. It can't just be one monolithic voice saying what we need to do and, you know, Black power this and all of that. We need to think about it from different aspects, because we're such a diverse community, right? Different experiences, different challenges. And I think it's going to take a collective voice for us to change that narrative and move forward in a fight for equality. In the book, you do urge readers to start their own conversation. So tell us why that was important for you.
Well, I think it's important because as we were talking before we came up, you know, I've been doing town hall meetings now for almost 30 years, and we like to gather and talk about our issues and our problems and the politics of it all. But then we don't typically move those issues into action. And so what I wanted to do was to say, hey, here's a book that allows you to hear different aspects of some of those same issues that we've talked about and that we continuously talk about. We're asking you to form your own groups, have conversations, and then act on those conversations. So if you're tired of the school system you live in, yet you've never done anything about it, you've never gone to city council, you've never gone to a PTA meeting, you've never held a discussion with the principal of that school, then you need to change that narrative. I was saying to a group the other day that 2020 for me is the first bellwether to see if African Americans are truly ready to change narratives. We have an opportunity to vote this man out of office. We have seen the debacle he's been, in my opinion, from the day he walked in. And this, Dorinda, is the first time, because I've tried to be a traditional journalist. I typically had not given my opinions over the course of my career. Many people didn't know where I sat politically. Occasionally they could guess, but I never publicly came out until this man took office. He's so inept and so unqualified that he's dangerous. And I, like many others, are saying that he should not be there. And we cannot make the same mistake and not turn out Most importantly, though, in terms of a new narrative, we can't just give our vote away, right? Which is what we've done for too long. So if we turn out, if we elect someone, then you've got to go to Black leadership, the Democratic Party, and say, listen, this is what we did, and this is our expectation. And while I don't think we're a monolithic people, I do think we are people of majority thought. And the simple example I give is go to a Black person's house and ask for pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. And then you will see that we are a majority thought, because you're going to get some sweet potato pie. And you're going to be looked at like you're crazy if you ask for some pumpkin pie. So I think it's important for all of us to understand that we are far more powerful than we believe ourselves to be. And we have to start to harness that power and make a difference.
So you've had these conversations, and like you said, you know, the thought leaders range from Maxine Waters to Killer Mike. And from your perspective, what is the state of Black America today? Well,
that's interesting, because that's the first chapter. You know, I ask everybody, how do you see the state of Black America? What do you see? And I think that Michael Eric Dyson, stealing a line from a great literary work, said without question, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It depends on who you ask. We've got some Black people who are supremely talented. Now they are rich. They have opportunity. You look at the Oprahs and the Beyoncés, and many people were watching The Last Dance last night with Michael Jordan. So there are certain people who've cracked that code, burst through that ceiling. The personification of that, of course, was Barack Obama when he won the election. But the vast majority of African Americans in this country, unfortunately, are still having issues by means of finding economic stability. We see the crisis we're in now, the health gap that has been here for decades. I did a commentary the other day talking about, I was watching Anderson Cooper, and he said, well, the one good thing about this is that this has uncovered the health disparity in America. No, it didn't uncover it. It's been there for years in plain sight. They said the same thing when we saw the spate of shootings by law enforcement officers of Michael Brown and Sandra Bland and the killing of Eric Garner and the like, saying that, oh, this has now been uncovered. No, it's been there for years. Hurricane Katrina, they said the winds uncovered the poverty that Black folks still have to deal with in urban areas like New Orleans. No, that poverty was still there. Many of us saw it when we were driving to Essence Fest. You drove right through many of those areas. And so we have to start understanding what we need to do and make demands not only of white leadership, but quite frankly, in my opinion, of Black leadership, who haven't always moved the needle. And we're very candid in this book. That's what I appreciate most of all in this book, the candid nature of everyone who came to the table and talked about what we need to do. And it's not a woe is me story. It is a what can we do story. That's what we have to get to.
Okay, there's a question for Ed. Let me see if I can pull it up, because it pulled up and then it went away. Maybe it's in my chat, but I'm going to look for it, but I'm going to keep going. So you wrote about the growing environment of hate and intolerance since Trump's candidacy. And regardless of anyone's politics, we can't deny that there's a huge awakening for many who thought that Obama's presidency would somehow reduce racial discrimination and bias, right? So as a result of his presidency, of the Trump presidency, we see this great divide once again. It's front and center, for all of us to see. And not only towards Black people, there's a dislike or distaste for women and other ethnic groups. So what was the most interesting or surprising conversations you had about Obama's legacy and impact, and the impact of the Trump era in the book?
So it's interesting because we have a chapter on Barack Obama's years, a reflection on, what those years were. We have a chapter that looks at, we call it Making America Hate Again. And that is a look at what the Trump presidency has done. And I think what the Trump presidency has done is two things. I think the Trump presidency has allowed us to look at racism for what it is, and intolerance and prejudice, which each one of those are different. Racism is not prejudice, is not intolerance. And we have each one of those in our country. You know, some more severe, one more severe than the other. But I think what we have to allow is that this dog whistle that Trump has done for so many years now, has going on, you know, into the fourth year, has allowed the idea of whites who have an inclination to still feel that blacks are inferior, that people of color are inferior, to say it out loud and feel comfortable with it. It has, even in people who I think have been reasonable about race for many years, feel an uneasiness. I have found myself growing in the feeling of intolerance at times, just by means of walking into a Starbucks or a store and looking at somebody who may have a buzz cut or some camouflage on and thinking about who I think they are and how they perceive me. I was in the store the other day and a woman had a Trump 2020 hat on, and I was furious. I don't know that woman, you know, I mean, I don't know how you can support him, but she might be a decent woman at the end of the day, but I could not see her that way as long as she had that baseball hat on. And so we have to understand what that's going to mean to this country if we continue to unravel as we've been doing. You know, this whole sense of him talking about it being the Chinese virus, you know, is another one of those dog whistles. And so we have to be brave enough to stand up and stop it and say that that is wrong. You know, we reflect on the Obama years, and what we found is Obama has been the pride of most African Americans in this country. He broke that glass ceiling that many of us thought would never be broken. I grew up believing I'd never see an African American president in my lifetime. He broke that. I tell a story about when I first sat down with him and he was getting ready to announce that he was going to run for the presidency. And I laughed in my head. I was like, yeah, whatever, man, you go ahead, because I didn't believe it was going to happen. But I find there's a divide in how many African Americans view President Obama's administration, not him personally, not the family. Everybody loves him personally, loves the family, loves Michelle even more, even loves Bo the dog. But what we do find is there is the camp that believes that he should have done more for African Americans specifically. And there's a camp who believes that he couldn't because of the stonewalling he received by Republicans. And so I think, again, we have to look back and use a historical lens and look at what was right about this presidency and what was wrong. No one is infallible. There were some issues with his presidency. And, you know, Black folk amongst ourselves are very paternal in terms of how we guard one another, and we should be, but we also have to learn how to realistically look at what life is, what leadership is, how we move forward, how we're seen, without it feeling like, oh, you're a Tom, or you're selling out, or you're not doing us right. As long as there is an intellectual component to what we're doing, and it's not totally emotional, we should be able to do that. And I think that's going to help us as we move forward. You know, one of the chapters talks about business and African Americans. And, you know, so many people found Robert Smith when he wiped out the debt for the Morehouse students a year ago in graduation. But many African Americans didn't even know who Robert Smith was. And here he was, the richest African American in the country. There's no way that the majority of Blacks shouldn't at least know who he is. We know who Jeff Bezos is. We know who Warren Buffett is. You know, how did we not know who Robert Smith is? These are the things that we have to start thinking about, how we're learning ourselves. I don't need a white man to tell me, or a white woman to tell me who Robert Smith is. I should know that.
Yeah, and I think there was too much onus put on Barack Obama to be this, you know, savior for all Black people. And when you examine the Trump era and the Trump presidency, I think it's a wake-up call for us to say, okay, we should be doing what we can at a local level to impact, you know, what we can do for our communities and for our people, because We can't depend on the president to do it alone. And Trump is a clear example of that. But I'm going to move on.
I think what we have is this sense of being beat upon for so long that there is a little bit of a woe is me factor sometimes. You know, we look at the idea of corporate America not readily pushing us up the ladder and not readily promoting us and giving us positions and being passed over. Well, how many decades do we have to see that to say, look, if you go into corporate America, that's probably going to happen. And until we start to design our own businesses and change the dynamic and not be so reliant on their abilities to say, we're kosher, we're okay, you're the one we're going to anoint, and do it for ourselves, that's really what we're going to have to get to. One of the chapters in the book talks about Blacks in the media. And we talk about Tyler Perry and what he's done as a mogul and what he's done as a producer. And that's a huge split in our community. But we also talk about the news. I tell a story about how Roland Martin and I laugh all the time because when we worked for white organizations, Black people were actually prouder of us than we worked for Black organizations. And though I made my name at BET and most people associate that with me, I still get people today who will tell me, saw you on BET the other week. I ain't been on BET in years, but I don't correct that because I know that's the association. What I do know and what I do understand is we have to start seeing ourselves, our accomplishments, just as great as we do if Don Lemon sits on the desk at night at CNN, or if Roland is trying to do his own thing. The truth of the matter is Roland has more power controlling his own entity than Don has sitting at an anchor desk at CNN. You're just seen by more people at CNN. But the more we start to say that this is the route we want to go, these are the people that we're going to support, doesn't mean you've got to drop CNN or MSNBC and the like. What it does mean is when you see African Americans out there and giving you something that is quality based, we have to then support them with vigor. Lastly, Rich Lou Dennis, who's the CEO of Essence Ventures, talks about the idea of being willing to pay a little bit more for something that's Black owned, because you know that the scale is such that I can't buy, let's say, donuts in the same way Dunkin' Donuts does. So a Dunkin' Donut will cost you $1. Mine might cost you $1.50 because I can't buy as many donuts. But are you willing to pay that extra 50 cents and support Blacks so I can grow? These are the new narratives we're going to have to start thinking about. Dorinda, I can't hear you. So I can't hear you, Dorinda. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I don't know how I got muted. I think you gave a lot of good perspectives. You know, one of the things that I always say about us as a people is there's so much talent within our community. We're innovative, we're creative. Why can't we create our own Fortune 500 companies, right? So again, to your point on changing the narrative, I think your book did a good job in helping us, you know, think about how do we change the narrative for our communities. Let's talk about, but before I get to that, let me get to one of the questions that came up. Somebody asked, who was the most provocative thought leader in your book?
Well, that's going to depend on, you know, your purview, I think. But I tried to get conservative voices as best I could. Michael Steele is in there, though Michael has become far more liberal, former head of the Republican National Committee, but he's far more liberal since Trump got in. Some people see Killer Mike as a very controversial. DeRay McKisson is in the book, and that's the brother, for those of you that don't know him by name, the brother that always has the blue ski vest on, who made a name for himself during Ferguson. We have a number of people who I think, again, depending on where you sit on the ladder, I mean, we've got Alicia Garza, who started Black Lives Matter, co-founded. And, you know, that's one of those organizations that has become interestingly looked at, because some people feel that they didn't do enough, that they fell off and weren't as readily ready to carry the baton as they should have been. And she says, just because we're not in the headlines every day doesn't mean that we're not moving forward. Van Jones is in the book, and Van has become one of those people in our community. Either you hate him or you love him. And so, you know, we have a little bit of everybody. The sister who started April Rain, who started Oscar So White, is in the book, and she's very candid about how we look at Blacks and their images in the media. Tarana Burke, who really is the person credited with starting the Me Too movement, is in the book, and she's very candid about how Black men have looked at her and the movement. And so it really depends on your purview, I think.
So let's talk about Black Girl Magic, because you dedicated a chapter to that. And in the book, you asked thought leaders, how are Black women shaping our current political climate? And I thought Tiffany Cross summed it up best when she said, the path to the White House leads straight through Black women, which we all, for people who don't know, the Black women have carried Democrats for the past 50 years who got elected as president. And you wrote, Black women didn't wait to be handed their power, they took it. Yet, in my opinion, Black women are still one of the most marginalized and disrespected groups in this country, right? And the adultification of our young girls, who are disproportionately and inappropriately exposed to adult knowledge and assume extensive adult roles and responsibilities in the household, are vulnerable to high rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And it's largely ignored and somewhat unknown in our communities. So in the book, you ask, how does the world look at Black women, and how does it affect how they view themselves? But I want to hear from you, based on those conversations, what do you want Black women to know about the power of their Black girl magic?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because we have so many, that chapter really was interesting to put together, because you have so many views of what Black women, who they are and what they do and what they have to go through, as you mentioned. I think what we're seeing is a renaissance of Black women understanding that they don't have to be given an okay to be powerful. Angela Rye talks about the idea that, you know, for so long, it was just being in the room, having a seat at the table, and then quietly doing what needed to be done without getting the kudos for it. But now we're seeing Black women get the kudos for it. And I think it's giving a generation of Black women a confidence that maybe they didn't have before outwardly. Black women were always confident, but they would take a step back as to not emasculate Black men, because they understood that the society had emasculated Black men for so very long. They didn't want to be part and parcel of that. I think there was, Tiffany talks about this, a little bit of angst about how Black men then took that and didn't give them kudos for understanding that, well, I am stepping back. You know, it isn't just you, and we maybe took more credit than we needed to. So it's a dynamic that is of interest, because there's that male-female dynamic that has nothing to do with race. Then you add the race component to it. But what I have seen, you know, my daughter is in her mid-20s, and what she has grown up seeing is completely different than generations before her. There is a sense with her group, who I've helped raise, of understanding what you can be. And I think that's the dynamic that we're seeing. I think it's also incumbent upon us to be careful with Black girl magic, because we can give a false sense of security and power and knowledge. There's one thing with giving confidence, but there's another thing with allowing people to believe that every Black woman in America is Olivia Pope. And that ain't true either, because there are a lot of Black women who feel like, well, I got red bottoms, real or painted. You know, I got a nice bag, I got a job, and I'm the you know what. Well, maybe and maybe not. And so I'm asking Black America to look at ourselves in the mirror with a reality filter, in knowing, you know, where you sit. But I think just the sense of accomplishment that Black people have shown, from, you know, sisters who are heading medical teams and emergency rooms who are rising. I just did a panel the other day with Dr. Patrice Harris from the American Medical Association, their first African-American president of that group. People like yourself, Dorinda, who I met through corporate America, who were dynamic and strong and weren't just going to take what corporate America had given you. You know, you were in there every day. And I told your boss this at a conference, that they should be proud to have someone like you who wasn't just giving lip service to not only the community, but to them when you reported back to say, hey, this is what we need to do, because it's betterment for all. And I keep saying, we've got to convince corporate America that diversity and inclusion, which is even more important, is what you want for a better bottom line at the end of the day. Because diversity is one thing. I can have a room of 50% Black folk and 50% white folk in our annual report and ask everybody to dress nicely that day. But if the 50% of the Black folk, the majority of them are junior members of an executive team and your cleaning crew, then the diversity doesn't mean anything. It's really about inclusion. And that's what I see for women. Women are demanding now to be included, not just in the room, but being a part of the decisions that are made in the room.
Yeah, I agree. But the one challenge that I think that we have with corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion is, in some companies, it's now a PR tactic, right? They'll sponsor the diverse event and put out a press release about it, or talk about, you know, how they're supporting this organization. But, you know, for the most part, it's just PR. They're really not doing what they need to do to advance Black leadership, particularly in P&L positions that get Black leaders to the C-suite. And that's our biggest challenge. We're stuck in the diversity inclusion roles, the human resource roles, corporate social responsibility, but we're not given the opportunity to really run a business.
So we talk about that.
Demand.
We talk about that in the book, and Maxine Waters talks about the idea that she is now putting together groups that will have corporations come back and report to her. What are the diversity moves that you're making? What are the mile markers that you've reached each year? Where are these people? Do they have green light capability? Who are their direct reports? Because without those things, without us looking for those things, to your point, it is just window dressing. The hard thing, and again, candidly, we talk about this in the book, many of our organizations and groups rely on corporate money to even sustain themselves. And corporate America feels like, well, I gave you money to have a backdrop at Essence Fest, you know, but now they're asking, how many cars did we sell because of that? How much insurance did we sell because of that? You know, did we move people to come to CVS because we sponsored the after party? And those hard questions are being asked like never before. And eventually those things may go away. And, you know, we cannot be, as Maxine Waters talks about, beholden to the same companies that, quite frankly, in another corner are keeping us down. That's the interesting place we find ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. I have another question for you.
Yep.
Marcia Jones from Seattle says, were you the speaker at Black Father, Daughter, Sweet Tea. And in your book, you didn't dedicate a chapter to the Black father. Can you speak on why you didn't?
Well, listen, we couldn't devote a chapter to everything that speaks to Black America. What I did is devoted a chapter to Black men in the chapter. And we talk about the woes of Black men. You know, we talk about Black women being sometimes relegated to a bottom rung as women are in our society. I might make an argument still, though, quite frankly, Dorinda, that Black men are even below the rung on the ladder when it comes to society. I think that men in general in corporate America still have a hierarchy, and you'll see that with Black men in corporate America often. But I think when you look at the societal question of where we kind of stack ourselves on the rung, I would argue that Black men may be below Black women. And so I decided to look at the idea of what Black men are going through even before fatherhood, let's say, even before you become a father. There's some real issues that Black men, some self-inflicted, quite frankly, have to go through in society and have to deal with. You know, there's the hypermasculinity that many men, no matter what their race, deal with, and men of color deal with it in an even grander scale. And I will tell you that we utilized Nipsey Hussle as an example of someone who could change and form his life and learned as he made mistakes and moved to a positive side. We saw that, and the book was finished before the untimely death of Kobe Bryant. But I was quite frankly shocked at the resonance of Kobe's death. Not the shocking part of a celebrity who was still young and vibrant, but the idea that, you know, he touched so many men in particular. I think everybody felt simply even a greater sadness because his daughter was on that ill-fated chopper flight. But the sense of him changing and crafting himself to become a better man and then accepting what he could do for women was extraordinary, you know, by means of the female game, the women's game. And so I think what we tried to do in that chapter was not look at fatherhood as much as manhood. And if you get the manhood part right, then the fatherhood part kind of follows in direct result to that, because anyone will tell you a real man at the end of the day is going to take care of his children, period.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I didn't know a lot about Kobe Bryant other than, you know, he was a player for the Lakers. But when I started looking at his videos and his love of the game and that Mambo mentality, I mean, he was really an inspiration. But I do want to talk to you about the Gayle King Snoop drama, because one of the disappointments for me was how many Black men voiced their opinion that they felt like they weren't supported by Black women. And then the misogynistic comments and behavior towards Gayle, even by Black women. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, we need to have a conversation among ourselves because there's something really wrong. So I wanted just to get your viewpoint on that.
So I will say, in all transparency, I emailed Gayle or texted her, one or the other, the day all of that started to explode, because I felt like, whoa, wait a minute now. Okay, I know how you feel, but let's give a sister a little bit of a break. And I wanted her to know that there were some people who just weren't outraged by what she did. I think what we saw there is what we see in one of the chapters of the book that's called Am I Black Enough for You? And this whole sense of, well, who defines what Blackness is and who says this is right and this is wrong? And so as a journalist, I probably would not have produced the piece the way Gayle did, but I think we have to start looking at, well, what was and what is the crux of when you begin something? What's in your heart? I don't think Gayle was trying to do that to degrade or denigrate a Black male. I think she thought she was giving someone who knew him well the opportunity to say who he was. Now, I thought it was probably the wrong move because she wasn't there that night. She couldn't speak to what happened in Colorado. But I did not think it deserved, the kind of grief that she received. And I was listening to a Gil Scott-Heron album last night, and there's a song he did called Message to the Messenger, where he's talking to young rappers, and he talks about how we can't have this kind of dichotomy where on one song you're talking about the sister being a Black queen, and on the very next song you're calling her the B word. So I think there's real sense of talking that we all need to do, not just between male and females. I think African Americans need to have real conversations about how we see one another. This whole sense of Blackness, and we're still caught up in light skin, dark skin. And the example I use is, okay, so if it's the blacker the berry, the sweeter the bush, and that if you're light, you don't really have the full Black experience, then what you're telling me is Clarence Thomas is blacker than Louis Farrakhan. You gonna stay with that one? So,
No.
I think there are a lot of conversations, hence the name of the book, that we need to have, whether it's a business conversation, whether it's a political conversation, whether it's a social conversation, whether it's a gender conversation. There are a lot of conversations that I think our community needs to have so we can start to work together, not walk in lockstep. We should still have diverse opinion. And that's what we haven't always allowed. That goes back to that pumpkin pie, sweet potato pie thing. But we should allow for someone to have a different feeling or different belief and not be a Tom, or not be, castigated by, the people who sit next to them. We need to figure out what can we collectively work on together that we all agree. Black Lives Matter, quite frankly, I thought was going to be that issue, because it didn't matter if you were rich or poor. It didn't matter if you lived in Beverly Hills or if you lived in Chino, California. Denzel could have been pulled over just as easily had he had a hoodie on and it was dark as a brother who, was in Watts. So I think we have to find, instead of getting caught up in our differences and our dislikes, let's get caught up in our commonality and find ways to work together on that.
Yeah, I agree. I remember there was an incident when I worked in corporate America where one of my colleagues, who was of a darker skin, said to me that I get more opportunities because I'm light skinned. And my response to that was, I still deal with the same microaggressions when I walk into that room. They don't see me as a light skinned Black versus a dark skinned Black. They see me as Black. And I'm fighting for the Black agenda and the multicultural agenda. So I have to deal with the same things that you do. The fact that I was able to be successful has nothing to do with the color of my skin.
Well, and I would, look, I've been light eyes, curly hair my entire life, right? Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't even sit and suggest that there isn't a comfort level with me, in a way, with Black people or with white people and some Black people, that if I was a far darker hue, that they may see me as more menacing. That's one of these issues that darker people around the world, it's just, I think, amplified in America, but dark people around the world typically are seen more often than not as more menacing, more this, more that. My issue is, look, if I'm treated that way, don't blame me for that. That's a white person's problem. That's an issue, but they still see me as an N-word. There's no question about that. Now, they may be more comfortable with me. They may not see me as more menacing, but why are you going to put that on me? Right? And at the end of the day, whatever dynamic that Black folk have to overcome, I still have to overcome it. They might let me in the door, but they still ain't comfortable with me marrying their daughter. Right? Yeah. No matter how light I am. And so, these are issues that we are getting caught up with on the sidelines. And while we're fighting over this mess, the folk over here are changing the game quietly. Look at what Trump has been able to do with the federal judgeships. These are appointments that will affect the rest of my life, my child's life, and if the judge is young enough, potentially my grandchild's life. That's what we need to be fighting, not this mess about, oh, you light and you can do, okay, whatever.
So speaking of that, I think the media has a role, because traditional media says that, you know, white is pure and good and, you know, we should all aspire to look a certain way. But what's the role of Black media in changing that narrative? And what's the state of Black media today? And what can we do to support and advance it?
So there are two sides of Black media that we talk about in the book. One is the news side, and one is the entertainment side. So let me deal with the entertainment side first. There's this split. We saw it with Spike Lee for years, and I think it has to do often with education and the dynamic of where you sit on the financial scale. You know, the Jack and Jill crowd likes less stereotypical fare. You know, they don't necessarily like soul playing. And this in and of itself is a generalization, but that's what we have to work on here. So, you know, we're more embarrassed by Medea than some others. I mean, there are all of these dynamics. Yet I'm quick to tell, and I say this in the book, Medea allowed Tyler Perry to become the mogul he has become. And so what I look at more than Medea is what Tyler has been able to do with his money and with his wealth and employing African Americans and the philanthropic side of what he's been able to do. And so you have to ask yourself sometimes a hard question. Is a Medea movie worth what he was able to do with the money made, you know, through the Medea movie? And he is the right person. You may have another person who make a Medea movie and wouldn't give anything to Black folk, you know? And so that's kind of where we sit. We're seeing more diversity in Hollywood. We're seeing more of both sides of the fence. I remember when the Cosby Show first came out, they talked about, meaning mainstream media, what a fantasy this was, and how could you have a lawyer and a doctor in the same household and Black household? Yet they never said that of Dynasty or Dallas. That wasn't a fantasy. That was just white folks in all of their splendor. And so we have to do two things. We have to support the things that we like and make sure that we support them, and all of that first 2 weekends and all the things we've been touting over the course of, you know, decades now, to make sure that it's registered and check your ticket on, all of that is real. We need to tell the people who create our art what we like and what we don't like. Social media allows us to do that directly. Certainly how you spend your money allows us to do. Ava DuVernay is a great example of someone who's been able to kind of broaden the scope of what we present and how we present it. We shouldn't be so critical on Black creators that if you create something that you don't like, you're all over them, because we don't do that for white creators. Tom Hanks can have a horrible movie, but you like the other 4 movies he made. Well, if a Black actor has a horrible movie, if Denzel has a clunker, that's okay. You know, go support the next 4. Nobody is going to be infallible. We need to start demanding that we support what we like, and let our creators and artists know. And we have to be accepting that, quite frankly, there is diverse opinion and taste in the Black community as relates to art. There are people who despise the Atlanta Housewives, for instance. Mm-hmm. But it's a whole lot of people who may not admit it publicly who love that show because of the ratings, and we know this. We also have to ask ourselves, in that fun, what do these images say to not a 35 or 40-year-old woman, but a 14-year-old Black girl who watches The Real Housewives, who can't always discern that, well, this ain't really real. And therefore you start emulating what you're seeing. As far as news is concerned, we are losing all of the Black news outlets that we had. Most Black newspapers have gone under. If you look at Black ownership, now that Rich Lou Dennis has repurchased or purchased Essence magazine and brought it under Black ownership again, we have that and Black enterprise on a national level. And that really is it. If Kathy Hughes tomorrow decides and Alfred decides to sell TV and Radio One, you got an issue, because BET is no longer Black owned, Bounce is not Black owned, Aspire is not Black owned. Yes, they have given kind of positions to people like Magic and Puffy, put them in a position of power, in quotes, in these entities, but these are all white owned establishments. Ebony is no longer Black owned, and is quite frankly and candidly hanging on by a string. Once those things are gone, you don't have the ability to really control your narrative, because at the end of the day, and we saw it with Melissa Harris Perry, if you choose to eliminate someone, they may put Joy Reid in that seat and replace Melissa with a Black woman for a Black woman. But if tomorrow they decide, you know what, we got a lot of Black people on here, let's put some Hispanic folk over here, or let's put some Asian folk over here, still color, we don't need to hear from all of these Negroes, then what do we do? Because we don't have that kind of ownership. So ownership, we've been saying this for decades now, ownership is vital and it's important. And so is the support. Again, I tell the story of how I shared in the book, how Roland Martin and I laugh all the time, because when we were on CNN or MSNBC, Black folk were even more excited because they saw it as real TV. When you're on BT or TV One, there's this slight, white man's ice is colder. What it is the white man's budget is bigger. That's what it is. And so therefore you have more resources. You can hire sometimes more talented people by means of the money you're able to give them. We have to start to really put ourselves in position to support one another and play the financial game a little bit better than we have over these decades.
I wholeheartedly agree. When I was in corporate America, I was a big supporter of Black media and Black news and everything. And I tried to support it as best I could. But quite frankly, multicultural budgets are small. And so, it not only takes corporate America, but it also takes us as individuals to go out and support, events and things that are happening, purchase the magazine, whether it's online, whether it's digital or print or whatever. But we have to do our part to make sure that we still have a voice in media. So thank you for that. I appreciate
There's a question here, Dorinda, if I may, that asks about Black media. It says, how do you feel about faux news, right-wing media using Black Lives Matter as a foil for their anger and hatred of Black people? Look, that's what they do. And if you take Fox News, they do it for their audience. They're speaking to their audience. What we allow is when it goes beyond Fox. I use Colin Kaepernick as an example. We allowed the narrative to be spun by mainstream media as well, that Kaepernick was kneeling, and then it became he was kneeling because he was against law enforcement, against the military, against police, against mom and apple pie. No, he was against injustice, and he was against law enforcement who did not give equal and fair treatment to African Americans. But we allowed that to spin out of control, and it became something entirely different. And so I think at this point, we have to make sure that we control our narratives in a way that we have not before.
Okay, I have another question. It was, wait a minute, lost it. It was mentioned that millennials and Gen Y are spoken to via representation of the book. But with your noted emotion on the lady with the Trump 2020 hat, who could be a decent woman, how should the millennials and Gen Yers navigate Blacks who have significant platforms, but may not facilitate an agenda on Black advancement, empowerment, and the potential deception that may come along with their platforms?
So I think the reality is and they go on to say, for instance, Kanye West, who's beloved by the Black community, but many not represent. Well, you know, just that. And then they talk about Candace Owens, and though she may look younger, blah, blah, blah. So listen, again, it goes back to the idea that we're not monolithic, right? And not everyone in Black America loves Kanye West, and not everyone sees Kanye West as a spokesperson for Black folks, but Kanye West is powerful by means of the society we live in and what social media allows. If you have a huge social media following, you are given a huge voice and given more credence, I think, than you may deserve. So Kanye West, for instance, word may carry simply more weight because it's going to be picked up than someone like Eric Holder, former Attorney General, because it's going to be seen on a daily basis by more people. It's certainly not a more educated stance on political matters, but it's the world we live in. I think that we have to be more discerning on who we determine to follow, quite frankly. And I think millennials are no different than baby boomers at that age. You know, if you're a baby boomer like I am, when you were 22, 25, you thought you knew everything. And you thought older people didn't know what was going on. Nothing's changed other than now you're the old people. And I try to remind my peer group that that is the case, that 50 is still 50. You know, when you hit 50, you like to believe, and you say crap like, well, 50 is new 30. No, it ain't. 50's 50, right? Mm-hmm. Ask somebody 20 if you at 50. Now, you might look good for 50 or 60, but you're old now in society's thinking. And so what I think we have to do is allow for baby boomers to be baby boomers. That whole okay boomer, well, okay boomer is also, and so boomers kind of, oh, okay, I'm not hip anymore. No, boomers need to say, okay, what you don't understand is X. And we also need to know that the world changes, and some of what we did and worked for us no longer works. But there has to be a meeting in the middle, which most generations don't do. I don't look at this any differently than any other cross generation that has ever come before or ever will come after. The smarter generations, which I don't think we've ever really seen, are those that can find a way to mesh and find ways to work together. So we talk about in the book, Black leadership. And the idea was interesting to me because I talked to some of the old guard leaders in the civil rights movement and some of the newer guard. And the old guard thought their communication with the younger people was better than the younger people thought, because they still felt like, well, you're still being a little paternal to me. Well, if you're 60 and you're dealing with somebody 22, you're gonna be a little bit paternal. It's how do we, in crucial times, not the silly stuff we get caught up in on a daily, but in crucial times, how do we make sure that we find a way to mesh? And that's what we have to do.
So I do want to talk about that, because before I left corporate America, we had done some research that showed that millennials do tend to rely on their grandparents for information and guidance. So I do think that there is a bridge, particularly for our community. Before I ask you the last question, I want to remind the audience to be sure to tune in next Monday at the same time in the same place, because we're going to have a MOBE Monday moment discussing the trials and triumphs of Black entrepreneurship with Michelle G. She's a managing partner at Strategic Alliance, Deidre Tate, president and CEO of Unlimited Contacts, and Ken Rye, Chief Marketing Advisor at Ken Rye Marketing and Hot Ice Entertainment Group. And Curtis Simons, one of the co-founders of MOBE, will be moderating that discussion. So be sure to tune in. So Ed, where can people find the book? How can they follow you? And
so as this is a marketing group, here it is. Let me market it. There's the book, Conversations in Black. It can be purchased wherever books are sold, as they say. You know, now would be a great time to try to find an independent African-American bookstore and support them. You can pay a little more than you would if you order it on Amazon, but you can order it, you know, wherever you would normally buy books. And, you know, again, I want to thank you, Dorinda, and the folk at MOBE for putting this through. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Ed L. Gordon, and I have a Facebook page, Ed Gordon Media. But I just want to say that I think all of us need to make sure that we understand, and now is the time. We're saying, well, we're all in this together, and that's kind of the phrase coming out of this crisis and chaos we're in. But we as African Americans need to kind of go back to that familiar feeling that we had in the past, become more linked, a bit more together, find the commonalities to move us through. And as I said, 2020 is really going to be a bellwether. We're going to see if in fact rubber meets the road, and we're willing to do the things that we say we are, and then make demands. Finally, make demands. We should be demanding right now of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. This is what we want. This is who we want. He may not ultimately pick that person for a VP slot, but he should be hearing from us.
And I have to be honest, this was the first year that I applied to be a delegate in my state, because I feel like we have to really be involved. We have to pay attention. We have to be active, and we have to encourage others to go vote, because we got to get this man out of office, point blank, period. But I want to thank you for your leadership, for bringing us these conversations, because they're so relevant for us, and helping to change the narrative, helping us to achieve the equality that we deserve. And I wish you nothing but the best. And hoping to bring you to Jersey at some point.
We're going to get there. When all this is over, we're going to get there. And look, it's 8-something and people trying to get over to see Babyface and Teddy Riley, because that done stopped all of Black America. Yes. So you better let them go vote.
But thank you
on
behalf of MOBE. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.